The trip had been planned for weeks. Everyone in the family was looking forward to a few days away from the noise of the city. Work had been stressful, school had been tiring, and it felt like life was moving too fast. A break was needed, something that could remind them of joy, sunshine, and togetherness. So they packed their bags, loaded up the car, and set off early in the morning with smiles on their faces. The road stretched out ahead of them, long but peaceful. The kids played games in the back seat, counting cars of different colors and laughing whenever they spotted something unusual on the road. The mother sat in the passenger seat, pointing out the green fields and tall trees, reminding everyone that nature had a way of calming the heart. The father, steady behind the wheel, hummed quietly to the sound of the radio. Glad to see his family happy, the drive itself felt like part of the adventure. They stopped once or twice for snacks and drinks, laughing over silly things like how the chips bag exploded when opened too quickly. These little moments, though small, were what made the trip feel special. For once, no one was thinking about deadlines, emails, or homework. It was just family, time, and freedom. When they finally arrived at their destination, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner, filled with the smell of the ocean. Their vacation spot was a small coastal town, the kind of place where life moved slower. The streets were lined with shops selling ice cream, souvenirs, and beach gear. Children ran around barefoot with sand on their legs, and older couples sat on benches watching the waves. It was exactly the kind of place they had been hoping for. The family checked into a modest but cozy rental house. It wasn't fancy, but it had everything they needed: a kitchen for home-cooked meals, a balcony that overlooked the water, and enough space for everyone to stretch out. The children raced to claim their beds, bouncing on the mattresses with joy. While the parents unpacked and laughed at their excitement, there was an unspoken sense of relief. This trip might just be the perfect escape they had all needed. That first evening was magical. They walked along the beach as the sun dipped low, turning the sky shades of orange and pink. The children chased the waves, squealing each time the water rushed up to their feet. The mother picked seashells, showing them off like treasures, while the father took pictures, capturing the way the light reflected on their faces. They ended the day with a simple dinner of grilled food and fruit, talking about what they would do tomorrow. Maybe a picnic, maybe exploring the town, maybe both. The children fell asleep almost instantly that night, tired from the day's excitement. The parents sat quietly in the living room, sipping tea and listening to the sound of waves crashing in the distance. For the first time in a long while, the house felt calm. No ringing phones, no rushing schedules, no city noise. Just peace. They both looked at each other with the same thought. This trip was going to be good for all of them. The next morning started bright and early. The children woke up eager, asking when they would go outside. Breakfast was quick: toast, eggs, and juice, and then bags were packed with snacks, water, and a blanket. Today was picnic day, and the whole family was ready for it. They drove to a nearby park that had been recommended by locals. A wide open space with plenty of trees, walking trails, and a view of the lake. As they arrived, the kids jumped out of the car first, running toward the open grass. Their laughter carried through the air, a sound that made every tired moment of parenting worth it. The mother spread out the blanket while unpacking sandwiches, fruit, and a small cooler. The father parked the car neatly and joined them, carrying the heavier bags. Everything seemed perfect. The weather was just right, not too hot, not too cold. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, and birds chirped as though they were adding music to the family's outing. The kids started a game of tag, their voices rising and falling with excitement. The parents watched with smiles, grateful for the moment. It was the kind of day that would stay in memory. Long after the vacation ended, other families were there too, enjoying the park in their own way. Some had fishing poles, others had bikes, and a few just sat under trees reading books. Everyone seemed relaxed, enjoying the gift of a sunny day. But as the Johnsons, though we won't call them by name here, settled in, not everyone looked at them with the same ease. A few passing glances lingered a little too long. Some faces turned away quickly, pretending not to notice. The father noticed it first, but chose not to say anything. He had grown used to it over the years, those silent stares, those quick judgments. He wanted his family to enjoy the day, not worry about strangers. So, he kept his focus on the laughter of his kids, the taste of the sandwich in his hand, the warmth of the sun on his face. But a quiet feeling sat in the back of his mind, one he couldn't shake. The mother noticed too. She caught sight of a couple whispering while looking in their direction. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to keep smiling for the children. Vacations were supposed to be about joy, about rest. She told herself not to let the unease ruin the moment. Still, something about those stares felt heavier than usual, and it made her wish they weren't so noticeable. For the kids, though, the world was still perfect. They chased each other, fell on the grass, got back up, and laughed until their sides hurt. They had no idea that adults nearby were casting judgment, or that a call was about to be made that would change the course of their day. The family didn't know it yet, but their peaceful picnic was about to turn into something else entirely, something that would test their patience, their dignity, and their strength. The sunlight was still warm, the sandwiches still tasted good, but somewhere nearby, a phone call had been made. Someone had decided that this family, simply enjoying their vacation, looked out of place, and within minutes, that single decision would bring flashing lights, stern voices, and questions no family should have to answer while on a holiday. The way an ordinary afternoon should. The family had already settled on the grass, finishing their sandwiches while the kids still darted back and forth with boundless energy. Their laughter filled the open park, mixing with the sound of the lake nearby and the occasional bark of a dog being walked on the path. Everything felt like it was going just right, but what they didn't know was that someone, sitting not too far away, was paying far too much attention to them. This person whispered into a phone, describing the family as suspicious. Suspicious of what? That was unclear. They weren't doing anything unusual, just eating, playing, and smiling like any other group of vacationers. Yet, in the caller's mind, their presence didn't fit. And with that one call, the tone of the afternoon began to shift. Even though the family was unaware, as the minutes passed, the kids started asking for juice. The mother reached into the cooler and handed out bottles, smiling as she wiped crumbs from their cheeks. The father leaned back on his elbows, stretching out in the sun. For them, it was just another lovely picnic moment. But just beyond the trees, two police cars were already making their way toward the park. Lights flashing quietly, sirens off for now. The first sign came as a flicker of red and blue across the leaves. The father noticed it out of the corner of his eye but didn't think much of it at first. Maybe an officer was passing through, or maybe there had been an accident nearby. But then, the sound of crunching tires on gravel grew louder. The cars were heading straight for the park entrance, slowing down near where the family sat. The children noticed the lights too, their game of tag halting as they turned their heads. "Why are the police here?" one of them asked innocently. The mother's smile faltered, but she quickly reassured them, "I'm sure they're just doing their job. Don't worry." Yet, inside, a knot of worry was already forming. Two officers stepped out, their belts heavy with equipment, their faces set in firm expressions. They looked around the park, scanning the area, before walking directly toward the family. Other people in the park noticed too. Conversations quieted, heads turned. The once relaxed air suddenly felt tense, like everyone was holding their breath to see what would happen. Afternoon, one of the officers said, voice clipped and serious, "We got a call about some suspicious activity. Can we ask what you're doing here?" The father sat up straighter, his calm demeanor steady. "We're having a picnic," he replied evenly, "just like everyone else here." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, glancing at the blanket. "The food, the kids. Do you have identification on you?" he asked, his tone leaving no room for refusal. The mother's hands tightened around the juice bottle she was holding. She felt her heartbeat quicken, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the situation didn't feel fair. Around them, other families were also picnicking, biking, or fishing, but none of them were being questioned. Only their family had drawn this kind of attention. The father reached for his wallet calmly. "May I ask why you need to see my ID?" he asked, keeping his voice level. The second officer, who had been standing just behind the first, spoke up. "We just need to confirm who you are. There have been reports of people who don't belong here." The words stung, though they were delivered in a matter-of-fact tone. "Don't belong here." as though enjoying the park required permission, as though their presence was automatically questionable. The children were now completely silent, their earlier laughter gone. They clutched their juice bottles and looked back and forth between their parents and the officers. One of them tugged gently at their mother's sleeve, whispering, "Did we do something bad?" The question nearly broke her heart. She bent down, smoothing her child's hair, whispering back, "No, sweetheart, not at all." The father stayed composed, but there was steel in his voice now. "We came here for a picnic. That's all. Is there a problem with that?" The first officer shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to back down. "We just need to be thorough, sir. Can we please see your license?" The father sighed quietly, pulling out his wallet and handing over his driver's license. The officer took it, studying it as if expecting to find something wrong. The second officer circled slightly, glancing at the car parked nearby, jotting down the license plate number. The whole display was unnecessary, but it continued anyway. Meanwhile, people in the park kept watching. Some pretended to look away, but their sideways glances betrayed their curiosity. Others stared openly, whispering to one another. It was as if the family had suddenly become a spectacle, put under a spotlight they had never asked for. The mother felt the weight of every single gaze pressing down on them. Minutes dragged on like hours. The children grew restless, their unease turning into fear. They clung closer to their mother, asking quietly when they could go home. She hugged them close, though inside she was trembling. Vacations weren't supposed to feel like this. The father, however, remained steady. He watched the officers with calm eyes, his patience holding firm even as frustration bubbled beneath the surface. He knew this wasn't about safety or suspicion. It was about perception. They weren't being questioned because of what they had done. They were being questioned because of how they looked. Finally, the officer handed back the license, his expression unreadable. "All right," he said flatly. "You check out." The words felt cold. They weren't an apology. They weren't an acknowledgement that the family had been unfairly singled out. They were just words meant to close the matter and move on, as if nothing significant had happened. But something had happened. The children's laughter had been stolen. The mother's sense of peace had been shaken. The father's patience had been tested. What had begun as an ordinary picnic had turned into an encounter that none of them would ever forget. The officers turned to walk back toward their cars, but the atmosphere of the park had already changed. The damage was done. The family sat quietly, trying to collect themselves. The mother stroked her child's back, whispering soft words of comfort. The father stared at the ground for a moment, then lifted his head, determined to stay strong. He knew this wasn't over. Something in his gut told him the encounter had only just begun, and he was right, because in the next moment, the officers turned back again, deciding their questions weren't finished after all. The officers had already stepped back toward their car, but something made them turn around again. It wasn't enough for them to see a driver's license, to confirm that the family was who they said they were. One of the officers adjusted his belt and walked forward once more, his boots pressing against the grass with a sense of authority that made the mother's chest tighten. "Sir," the officer began, his voice more commanding this time, "we'll need to ask you a few more questions." The father raised his head slowly. He had expected this. It was rarely that simple, rarely a matter of showing ID and being left alone. There was always something more, another suspicion, another reason to dig deeper. He stayed calm, though his children were now clinging to their mother's side. Wide-eyed and confused. "What kind of questions?" the father asked, his voice steady. "Where are you from? Where are you staying? How long have you been here?" The officer rattled off, almost like a checklist. The mother frowned. These were not questions about safety. These were questions about belonging. Questions that hinted at the idea that this family, unlike others in the park, had to explain why they had the right to sit on the grass and enjoy a sunny day. The father answered calmly, without hesitation. He explained where they had traveled from, mentioned the rental house near the beach, and added that they planned to stay for the rest of the week. His words were simple, but his tone carried weight. He was cooperating, but he was not intimidated. The second officer scribbled in a small notepad, as if these ordinary answers were pieces of some larger puzzle. "Do you have proof of where you're staying?" He asked next. The mother's patience cracked. Proof? You want us to show proof of where we're sleeping at night just to have a picnic? Her voice shook, but it was no longer from fear, it was frustration. The first officer glanced at her, but didn't respond to the challenge. Instead, he focused on the father again. Sir, if you could just cooperate, this will go a lot faster. The father took a slow breath. I've cooperated. You have my license. You know who I am. My family is sitting here having lunch, the same as anyone else in this park. What exactly is it you think we've done? For a moment, silence hung in the air. The children shifted uneasily, sensing the tension even if they didn't fully understand it. A dog barked in the distance. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Yet in the small circle of grass where they sat, time seemed to freeze. The officer's jaw tightened. We're just following up on a report, he said. The father nodded slightly. A report that said what? That a family was eating sandwiches under a tree? The words cut sharp, though spoken quietly. The officer didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth was too obvious, too uncomfortable to put into words. The second officer stepped closer now, trying a different approach. His tone was softer, but still carried authority. Look, sir, we're not here to cause trouble, but we need to make sure everything checks out. These kinds of calls, we can't ignore them. You understand? The father looked at him for a long moment. His calm expression never wavered, but his eyes told a deeper story of years spent facing the same assumptions, of endless patience being tested again and again. I understand, he said finally, but what I don't understand is why my family has to go through this when no one else here does. The second officer had no response. He shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the crowd of onlookers. People were still watching, some with pity, some with curiosity, others with unease. A few parents had pulled their children closer, not wanting them to stare too openly. Yet everyone knew what was happening, even if no one said a word. The mother pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, as though it could shield her from the heavy air pressing down. She whispered to the children, telling them to focus on their juice boxes, trying to distract them. But the kids kept looking up at the officers, sensing the unfairness even if they couldn't name it. The father, still seated, placed his hands calmly on his knees. I've answered your questions. If you have more, you can be clear about why. Otherwise, I think my children deserve to enjoy the rest of their afternoon. It was a statement, not a plea. The first officer looked like he wanted to push further, but something in the father's tone made him pause. There was authority in those words, a quiet strength that made it clear this man wasn't someone to be dismissed. Still, the officer pressed one more time. Do you have any other form of identification? The father studied him. His silence stretched long enough that even the mother turned to look at him, wondering what he was thinking. Then, without a word, he reached into his wallet again, not for a license this time, but for something else. He held it out steadily, the leather case opening to reveal a badge. The officers froze. Their faces shifted instantly, their tough expressions cracking into surprise. It was not the badge of an ordinary citizen. It was the badge of someone who carried authority far beyond a picnic in the park. The silence that followed was heavy, almost embarrassing. The officers exchanged a quick glance, suddenly unsure of themselves. The crowd, though they couldn't see what had been revealed, sensed the change. Something had shifted in the balance of power. The father said nothing at first. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment sink in. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm. Now, do you understand who you've been questioning? The officers swallowed hard. Their earlier confidence had drained away, replaced with awkwardness and regret. One of them stammered, We didn't realize, you didn't need to realize. The father interrupted, his voice still even. All you needed to realize was that this was a family having lunch. The words landed with the force of truth. Simple, undeniable truth. The officers shifted uncomfortably, mumbling apologies that sounded weak and unconvincing. The mother sat silently, her arm around the children, her face unreadable. The kids didn't fully understand, but they sensed that something important had happened, that their father had turned the tables, that the men in uniforms no longer looked powerful but small. The officers retreated slowly, promising to clear things up and make sure this doesn't happen again. But the family knew the damage was done. The afternoon had been stolen from them, replaced by fear, frustration, and a lesson the children should never have had to learn. As the officers walked back to their cars, the father closed his wallet and slipped it into his pocket. He looked at his family, his expression softening again. "It's all right," he said quietly. "We're together. That's what matters." The mother nodded, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. The children leaned into her, comforted by her warmth even if they didn't have the words to explain their feelings. The picnic continued, but the mood had changed. The laughter was slower to return. The food no longer tasted the same. Yet beneath it all, there was a quiet strength and knowledge that despite the humiliation, despite the fear, they had held their ground with dignity. And though the officers had walked away, the story was far from over. The police cars rolled away slowly, their flashing lights dimming as they disappeared beyond the trees. The sound of gravel crunching under the tires lingered, and then silence settled back over the park. It should have felt peaceful again, but it didn't. The air was heavier now, as if the afternoon had lost its sunshine, even though the sky was still bright. The children were the first to break the silence. One of them whispered softly, "Why did they come to us?" The question was so innocent, yet it carried the weight of everything that had just happened. The mother brushed her child's hair gently, searching for the right words. "Sometimes people make mistakes," she said carefully. "They didn't understand who we are. But we're fine now. You don't need to worry." Her tone was soothing, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside her. She hated that her children even had to ask that question, hated that their carefree game of tag had turned into something frightening. The father sat quietly for a while, his hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. He watched his children, watched their faces shift between confusion and fear, and it made something deep in his chest ache. He had worked so hard to give them a safe life, to shield them from moments like this. And yet, here it was unfolding in front of them. The youngest child tugged on his sleeve. "Did we do something wrong?" The father shook his head firmly and pulled the child into his lap. "No," he said gently. "You didn't do anything wrong. We were just eating and playing. That's all. This wasn't about you doing anything bad. This was about other people not understanding." The children leaned against him, listening but still unsettled. Kids had a way of sensing when something was bigger than the words adults used to explain it. They could feel the tension even if they didn't fully understand the cause. The mother tried to distract them. She pulled out some cookies from the picnic basket, passing them around. "Here," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You were asking for these earlier, remember?" The children accepted the cookies, nibbling quietly, but their usual excitement was missing. The sweetness didn't erase the memory of uniformed men standing over them, demanding answers. The picnic blanket, once a place of laughter and crumbs, now felt like a stage where something uncomfortable had played out. Around them, the other families in the park began to relax again. Conversations picked back up, though the occasional glance still drifted toward the family. Some people looked apologetic, others avoided eye contact altogether, as if pretending nothing had happened. The father noticed it all, but kept his focus on his own family. What mattered now was repairing the small cracks the moment had left behind. He leaned closer to his wife and whispered, "Let's not let them take this day from us." She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I'll try," she whispered back. The father stood up, dusting off his pants, then stretched his arms wide. "Who wants to race me to that tree over there?" he asked suddenly, pointing to a large oak tree across the grass. The children blinked at him, surprised. A race, after everything? But then, slowly, one of them smiled. Another giggled. Within seconds, they were scrambling to their feet. "Me, I'm going to win," one shouted, the earlier tension breaking just a little. The mother watched as they lined up at the starting spot. The father bent down, pretending to take it seriously. "On your mark," he said in a booming voice. "Get set, go." They all took off across the grass, legs pumping, laughter finally returning to the air. For a few seconds, the fear melted away, replaced by the simple joy of running. The father pretended to run slowly, letting the children pull ahead, their voices ringing with triumph as they reached the tree first. The mother clapped softly from the blanket, smiling for real this time. For that brief moment, it felt normal again. The park was just a park, the family was just a family, and the afternoon was theirs to enjoy. But as the laughter faded and they walked back to the blanket, the heaviness returned. The children were calmer now, but questions still lingered in their eyes. They didn't ask them out loud, maybe because they weren't sure how. Instead, they stayed close, as if afraid that if they wandered too far, something else might happen. The father noticed and put an arm around both of them. "You know what makes us strong?" he asked. The kids shook their heads. "Sticking together," he said. "No matter what happens, as long as we're together, we're okay." The children nodded, comforted by the certainty in his voice. As the afternoon went on, the family tried to carry on with their picnic. They ate more of the food, shared stories, and even managed to laugh at a squirrel that boldly tried to steal a piece of bread from the basket. Slowly, the shadows of the earlier moment began to fade, but they never disappeared completely. They lingered at the edges, like a reminder that happiness was fragile. When it was finally time to pack up, the children helped fold the blanket and gather the empty bottles. Their small hands worked carefully, almost as if they understood that keeping busy helped ease the mood. The mother carried the basket, the father held the cooler, and together they walked back to the car. The drive back to the rental house was quiet. The children leaned against each other in the back seat, drowsy from the day but still thoughtful. The mother gazed out the window, her mind replaying the scene over and over. The father kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set, his thoughts a mixture of anger and determination. When they reached the house, the children went inside first, eager to rest. The mother lingered by the door, turning to her husband. "They saw you," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "Yes, and now they know. But it shouldn't have taken that," she said, her voice low but firm. "It shouldn't have taken a badge for them to treat us with respect." The father looked at her for a long moment, then placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "I know, and that's what hurts the most." Inside, the children were already sprawled on the couch, asking if they could watch a movie before bed. The parents exchanged a tired smile. Life had to go on, even after moments like this. And maybe, just maybe, showing their kids love, laughter, and resilience was the best answer to everything that had happened. That night, as the waves crashed softly outside, the family sat together, close, holding on to the one thing that couldn't be shaken, each other. The next day began with a quiet stillness inside the rental house. The children were slow to wake up, as if their little bodies were carrying the weight of yesterday's tension. The parents moved carefully round the kitchen, preparing breakfast in silence. The smell of eggs and toast filled the room, but the mood was subdued. The father poured himself a cup of coffee and stared out the window at the waves rolling in. He looked calm on the outside, but inside he was replaying every detail of the encounter at the park. The flashing lights, the questions, the fear in his children's eyes, it all sat heavy on him. He had faced tense situations before, but nothing cut deeper than watching his family go through it. The mother placed a plate on the table, breaking the silence. "We should take the kids somewhere fun today," she said gently. "Something light. They deserve it after yesterday." He nodded slowly. "You're right. We'll make today different." By mid-morning, they decided to visit the town's small pier. It was filled with colorful shops, arcades, and food stalls selling cotton candy and fried snacks. The children's eyes lit up as they spotted games with stuffed animals hanging above the stands. Their excitement brought some relief to their parents' hearts. For a while, everything felt normal again. The kids laughed as they tried to win prizes, squealed with delight when they finally got a toy, and begged for ice cream, despite already having sticky fingers from cotton candy. The parents held hands as they watched, grateful for these lighter moments. But the peace didn't last long. As they walked toward the end of the pier, the father noticed two familiar figures leaning against a railing. The same officers from the park. Their uniforms looked sharper in the sunlight, but their faces carried the same uneasy expression. The mother noticed too. She tensed immediately, her grip tightening on the children's hands. "Not again," she muttered under her breath. The officers straightened as they spotted the family, then approached with hesitant steps. Their body language was different this time, not the confident stride of authority, but something closer to caution. "Sir," one of them began, his voice softer than the day before. "We wanted to apologize for what happened yesterday." The children looked up at their father, confused. They weren't used to seeing officers backtrack. The mother stayed silent, her expression guarded. The father didn't respond right away. He simply studied the officers, letting them squirm in the silence. Finally, he said, "Do you know what my children asked me yesterday? They asked if we did something wrong. Do you understand what that means? You turned a simple picnic into a moment that made my kids doubt themselves." The first officer shifted uncomfortably. "We were acting on a report. We didn't mean, you didn't mean." The father cut in, his tone still calm but sharper now. "You didn't mean for my children to sit in fear? You didn't mean to question why we were there when dozens of other families were doing the same thing? Tell me, did you ask anyone else for ID yesterday?" The officer dropped his gaze, unable to answer. The second officer opened his mouth as if to explain, but stopped. Realizing there was no explanation that would make sense, the father reached into his wallet again. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out the leather case and opened it, revealing his badge once more. The sunlight caught on the emblem, making it shine. "This," he said firmly, holding it up, "is who I am. I've worked for years to serve this country. I've faced situations you can't imagine. And yet, even with this badge in my pocket, my family was treated like criminals in front of strangers. What does that tell you?" The officers froze, their faces pale. They hadn't expected this confrontation, not here, not now. The mother stood tall beside her husband, her voice steady. "It tells us that even when a man has spent his life protecting others, he can't protect his family from being judged unfairly. That's what it tells us." The crowd on the pier had started to notice. People passing by slowed down, curious about the quiet but intense exchange. The children clung to their parents' sides, not fully understanding, but sensing the seriousness of the moment. The father lowered his badge but kept it in his hand, his gaze locked on the officers. "You see this and suddenly your tone changes. Suddenly you want to apologize. But my children didn't need an apology after seeing a badge. They needed respect before you even knew who I was." The words hit harder than raised voices ever could. They were calm, measured, and undeniable. The officers stumbled through apologies again, but their words felt hollow. They promised to do better, to make sure it doesn't happen again. The father didn't argue further. He simply put his badge away and said, "You should think about the next family you meet, because not every father is going to show you this, and not every child is going to walk away from it with their spirit intact." The officers nodded quickly, their embarrassment obvious. They stepped back, retreating into the crowd, eager to disappear from the eyes now watching them. The father turned to his family. The children looked up at him with wide eyes, half in awe, half in confusion. The mother exhaled slowly, releasing a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He crouched down so he was eye level with his kids. "Do you see this?" he asked, tapping the pocket where he had placed the badge. "This is part of my job, but you need to know something important. It doesn't matter what job someone has or what badge they carry. What matters is that every person deserves respect, no matter what." The children nodded slowly, their little minds trying to process the lesson. They might not fully understand yet, but one day they would. And when they did, they would remember the calm strength in their father's voice. The family continued down the pier, holding hands tighter than before. The ocean breeze brushed against their faces, the smell of salt water mixing with the sounds of seagulls overhead. The children began to chatter again, pointing out boats and asking if they could ride one. Life moved on, as it always did, but something had shifted. The father's revelation had not only changed the way the officers saw him, it had reminded his children that dignity is not given by anyone else. It is carried within, no matter the circumstances. That night, back at the rental house, the family sat together on the balcony, watching the sunset. The children leaned against their parents, tired but content. The father wrapped an arm around his wife, pulling her close. "We'll remember this trip," she said softly. He nodded. "Not for what happened yesterday or today, but for how we stood together." The waves crashed gently in the distance, steady and unbothered, as if to remind them that life's storms always pass. And in that quiet moment, the family found peace again, not because the world had changed, but because they had faced it together. The evening after the pier encounter felt different from the others. The family had walked back to their rental house with slower steps, the children trailing behind, still holding tightly to their parents' hands. The sunset was painted across the sky in streaks of gold and red, but none of them really stopped to admire it. The day had left them drained, heavy with thoughts that no vacation should carry, inside. The children settled quickly onto the couch, cuddling into a blanket and asking for cartoons. Their voices were light again, though a little too eager, as if trying to cover up the unease still clinging to them. The mother switched on the television, letting the familiar sounds of animated laughter fill the room. She knew it was their way of finding comfort, of pretending everything was normal again. In the kitchen, the father stood by the counter, pouring himself a glass of water. His wife joined him quietly, leaning against the sink. Neither spoke at first. They just stood side by side. The only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the muffled giggles from the cartoon in the other room. Finally, she broke the silence. They only apologized because of the badge. He nodded slowly. I know. Her voice cracked slightly as she went on. If you hadn't shown it, they wouldn't have stopped. They would have kept pushing, kept treating us like we didn't belong. The father's jaw tightened. He had thought the same thing, but hearing it aloud made it sharper. He turned to face her, his expression calm but his eyes heavy with sadness. You're right, and that's what hurts. Respect shouldn't depend on what I do for a living. It shouldn't take a badge for them to see our worth. She looked down at the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. What about the kids? What do we even tell them? They're too young to carry this kind of weight. He placed a hand on her shoulder gently. We tell them the truth, but in a way they can understand. We show them that even in moments like this, we don't lose who we are. They'll learn strength from how we carry ourselves. The words settled between them, not erasing the pain, but giving it meaning. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, the parents sat on the balcony. The waves rolled in steadily, the moon casting silver light on the water. The father leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. You know what struck me the most? He said softly. What? The way they changed in an instant. 1 second, they were questioning me like I was a threat. The next, they were stumbling over apologies. Not because they realized they were wrong, but because they realized who I was. The mother sighed, nodding. And that's the problem. To them, you had to prove yourself. But to us, to our children, you've never had to. You've always been enough. Her words made him smile faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. That's why I carry myself the way I do, he said. Not for them. For you. For the kids. To show that dignity doesn't come from anyone else, it comes from within. The shift in power had been clear at the pier. The officers had walked away humbled, their authority cracked in the face of truth. But for the family, the feeling was bittersweet. Power wasn't what they had wanted. All they had wanted was peace, a simple vacation, without being questioned for existing. The next morning, the children woke up earlier than usual. They seemed lighter, perhaps sensing that their parents had worked through the heaviness of the night. They begged to go to the beach again, wanting to play in the sand and splash in the waves. Their laughter returned, genuine this time, and the parents couldn't say no. At the beach, the family built sandcastles, their hands sticky with salt water and grit. The children raced to collect seashells, proud of every small discovery. The mother laughed as one of them tried to bury their father's feet in the sand. For a while, everything felt pure again. But even there, the father's mind wandered back to the pier. He thought about the way the officers' eyes had shifted when they saw his badge. He thought about the silence that followed, the hollow apologies, the way the crowd had looked on. He realized that the power shift wasn't just about him. It was about every family who might never have that moment, who might never be believed, who might never get that sudden change in treatment. When the children ran off to chase the waves, he turned to his wife. You know, what happened wasn't just about us. It's about how often this happens to people who don't have anything to show. People who don't have something that makes the world pause and reconsider. She nodded solemnly. That's why it's even harder. Because we saw the difference, and we know what it means for others. He looked out at the horizon, the ocean stretching endlessly. That's why we have to keep teaching the kids. They'll face moments like this again. But if they learn now that they carry their worth inside them, no one can take that from them. The beach day carried on, filled with laughter, sunburns, and sandy toes. Strangers smiled at them, and for once, those smiles felt genuine, not cautious or suspicious. The children's laughter echoed against the waves, erasing some of the heaviness that had settled on their hearts. That night, the family cooked dinner together in the rental house. They sang along to a song on the radio while chopping vegetables and stirring pots. The kitchen filled with warmth, both from the food and from the way they leaned into each other. Finding strength in their togetherness, when the children went to bed, the parents sat quietly again, this time not in silence, but in gratitude. Gratitude that despite the ugliness they had faced, they had not been broken by it. Gratitude that their children still had laughter in them, that their family bond had only grown stronger. The father knew the officer's apologies were nothing compared to the weight of the harm done. He knew words alone couldn't erase what his children had seen. But he also knew that the real power wasn't in the badge he carried, it was in the way his family carried each other through moments like this. The shift in power hadn't just humbled the officers. It had reminded the family of their own resilience, their ability to rise above and hold their dignity intact. And as the waves outside kept crashing, steady and unwavering, the family understood that they, too, could remain steady, no matter what storms came their way. The vacation was supposed to be about fun, about beaches, ice cream, and laughter. But when the last morning came, and the family began packing their suitcases, it was clear this trip had turned into something else, something heavier, yet unforgettable. The children moved slowly, folding their clothes with the kind of care that only came after a week full of ups and downs. Their toys, scattered across the rental house, were gathered into bags. The mother walked from room to room, checking drawers and closets, making sure nothing was left behind. The father loaded the car in silence, his movements steady but thoughtful. As they prepared to leave, the mother noticed the children staring quietly out the window at the ocean one last time. She walked over and knelt beside them. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. One child shrugged. "I like the beach," another added. "I didn't like when the police came." The words hung in the air, simple but sharp. The mother pulled them close, kissing their foreheads. "I know," she whispered, "but remember what we said. You didn't do anything wrong." "None of us did," the father overheard, pausing in the doorway. He wanted to add something, but for a moment, he stayed quiet. He wanted to make sure his words would last. Finally, he joined them, crouching down to their level. "You remember when we talked about strength?" he asked gently. The children nodded. "Strength isn't just about being tough," he said. "It's about holding your head high, even when people don't treat you the way they should. It's about knowing who you are and never letting anyone take that away." The children nodded again, their little faces serious. They didn't fully understand, but the seed of the lesson was planted. One day, they would. The drive back home was long. The roads stretched endlessly, winding through towns and fields, carrying them away from the ocean and back toward their everyday lives. The children dozed in the back seat, their heads leaning against each other. The mother sat quietly in the passenger seat, gazing at the horizon. The father kept his eyes on the road, his thoughts deep. Every so often, he replayed the image of the officers' faces when he revealed his badge. The shock, the sudden change in tone. It still unsettled him. He didn't feel pride in that moment. He felt frustration that respect had been given not because of who he was as a man, a father, a human being, but because of a symbol on a piece of leather. As the hours passed, the family stopped for gas, snacks, and bathroom breaks. At one small diner, the children laughed again, fighting over who got the bigger piece of pie. Their parents smiled, glad to see the lightness returning, even if only in bits and pieces. By the time they reached home, night had fallen. The house greeted them with the familiar smell of their own space. The children ran inside, eager to see their rooms again. The parents carried in the bags slowly, fatigue settling into their bodies. Later that night, after the children were asleep, the mother and father sat together in the living room. The house was quiet, but their minds were not. "We'll never forget this trip," she said softly. He nodded. "No, and neither will the kids." She looked at him, worry etched on her face. "Do you think it changed them?" His gaze was steady. "Yes, but maybe not in the way we fear. They saw something unfair, but they also saw us stand strong. They saw that we didn't bend or break. That matters, she exhaled, leaning against him. I just wish they didn't have to see it at all. I know, he said, wrapping his arm around her. But this world isn't perfect. What we can do is prepare them. Teach them that they are enough, that their worth doesn't depend on anyone else's opinion. The silence stretched between them, filled with both pain and comfort. In the days that followed, life returned to routine. The children went back to school, the parents back to work. From the outside, everything looked normal again. But inside the family, something had shifted. The children carried quiet questions in their eyes, questions they didn't always put into words. The parents carried a new determination to make sure those questions were answered with love, strength, and honesty. One evening, as the father tucked his children into bed, one of them asked softly, "Daddy, will the police ever bother us again?" He paused, brushing the blanket over their shoulders. "I can't promise it won't happen," he admitted, "but I can promise you this: I'll always protect you. And even more important, I'll always remind you that you don't need anyone else to tell you who you are. You already know." The child smiled faintly, comforted by the certainty in his voice. "Okay," they whispered before closing their eyes. The father stayed a little longer, watching them drift to sleep. He thought about the weight of his badge, the responsibility it carried, and the strange irony that it had both exposed and protected his family in the span of a few days. He knew he couldn't change every mind in the world, but he could shape the hearts of the two children sleeping peacefully before him. That was his greatest mission. Downstairs, his wife was writing in a small notebook she kept for reflections. She wrote about the ocean, about the laughter, about the fear, and about the strength they found together. She didn't want the story to be remembered only for the pain. She wanted it to be remembered for the resilience, the way they had held on to one another. Weeks later, when friends asked how their trip had been, the family shared the highlights: the beach, the pier, the games. They left out the harder parts, not because they wanted to hide them, but because those moments were theirs, to be explained away in casual conversation. But in private, within the walls of their home, the lessons lived on. The children remembered the race to the tree, the cookies on the picnic blanket, the waves crashing on their feet. They also remembered the flashing lights and the questions, and in time, they would understand the full meaning of both. The parents knew the world might test them again, but they also knew their family had grown stronger, stronger in love, stronger in patience, stronger in truth. The trip that began as a vacation had become something more, a story of resilience, a story of dignity, a story their children would carry with them forever. And though the memory of flashing lights might never fully fade, neither would the memory of how they stood together, hand in hand, stronger than the storm around them.